James always thought that being an adult meant keeping his bills up to date. At 34, he had built a perfectly functional life, a mortgaged apartment, a paid-off car, health insurance, a private pension. Every first day of the month, he sat down at his computer with the precision of an accountant, marking each payment as a small victory against the chaos of the world. There was something almost meditative about this ritual, the sound of the click confirming transfers, the comforting green of paid spreading across the screen. He worked as a financial analyst for a decade, climbing the corporate ladder with the same methodology he applied to his personal finances. Consistency, discipline, zero surprises. His colleagues respected him for his reliability. His bosses praised him for his stability. "James is solid," they would say, and he would smile with genuine pride. Solidity was a virtue, wasn't it? In a volatile world, being predictable was valuable. But lately, when he closed his monthly expense spreadsheet, a strange feeling had been nagging at him. It wasn't financial anxiety, in fact. It was better than ever. It was something more subtle, as if he'd spent years drawing up the blueprints for the perfect house and only now realized he'd never decided where he wanted to live. The apartment was spotless, but when was the last time he'd looked out the window? When had he stopped to smell the coffee he'd brewed every morning? The revelation came on a typical Tuesday during a meeting about quarterly projections. James was presenting productivity charts when he heard his own voice as if it were someone else's. The words came automatically: profit margin, resource optimization, sustainable performance, as his mind drifted away from the situation. He looked at the faces around the table, all engrossed in tablets and laptops, and had the bizarre feeling that he was watching a theater of the absurd. "Sorry," he interrupted in the middle of a sentence about growth indicators. "Do you think that really matters?" The silence that followed was deafening. His boss, Mr. Peterson, raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean, James?" He tried to explain, but his words got all jumbled up. How could he say that suddenly everything seemed like an elaborate game where everyone pretended that moving numbers from one spreadsheet to another had extreme meaning? He finished the presentation as best he could and went back to his desk. But the computer seemed strange, as if it were the first time he had seen it. He opened his calendar and counted. For the next 6 months, he had only work commitments, routine doctor's appointments, and mandatory family gatherings. Not a single item that genuinely excited him. Not a single little adventure, a leisure course, a trip with no specific purpose. It was as if he had outsourced his life to a very efficient but unimaginative assistant. The following weekend, James did something he hadn't done in years. He walked aimlessly around the city. Not to exercise, he had a gym for that, but out of pure curiosity. He discovered a bookstore that had been around for 2 decades 5 blocks from home. A cafe that served homemade pies and watched people in the park leisurely feeding ducks. How had he missed all that? When had his life become a straight line between points A and B, with no detours to points C, D, or Z? He sat on a bench and watched a man in his 60s teaching his grandson how to fly a kite. The boy ran around uncoordinatedly, laughing out loud every time the kite crashed. The grandfather was not frustrated. On the contrary, he seemed to be having as much fun as his grandson. James laughed too, and to tell the truth, he couldn't even remember the last time he had laughed like that, not just for the sake of being polite at meetings, but genuinely laughing. He went home with a question gnawing at his mind. When did he stop trying new things? When did he start treating life like an engineering project where each element needed to have a specific function and guaranteed return? He opened the closet and found a dusty guitar, bought at a time when he believed he would learn to play someday. Someday had become never, and that never contained a collection of abandoned objects and dreams postponed indefinitely. The conversation with Emma, his younger sister, was revealing in a way he hadn't expected. She had called to tell him about a new art show she was organizing. Emma had always worked on things that James secretly thought were useless. For years, he had worried about her choices, offering advice on financial stability and career planning. But that afternoon, as she animatedly described an installation about emotional memories, James realized that Emma was shining in a way he hadn't in a long time. "Are you okay, James?" she asked suddenly. "You seem distant." He hesitated, then told her about the strange feeling he had been feeling. Emma was quiet for a moment. "Remember when we were kids and you wanted to be an archaeologist? You'd spend hours digging in the backyard, looking for ancient treasures. Mom would get mad at you for destroying the garden, but you didn't care. Your eyes were shining just like mine now." James swallowed hard. He had completely forgotten about that version of himself. What happened to that boy? Emma asked gently. The question kept echoing after they hung up. James tried to remember when exactly he had traded curiosity for security, adventure for predictability. It wasn't a conscious decision, but rather a series of small choices that, when added together, created a life that worked perfectly on paper, while at the same time giving the impression of someone wearing a very fancy, tight outfit that they can't take off. The turnaround came where he least expected it. James was organizing old documents when he found a letter he had written to himself when he was 25. In one of those self-discovery exercises he had considered silly at the time. His handwriting was looser, his ideas bolder. 25-year-old James talked about traveling solo through South America, learning 3 languages, maybe starting his own business. There was a list of must-do experiences before 35, diving with sharks, taking an Italian cooking class, spending a month without internet, writing a book about anything. The deadline was 6 months away. James laughed a laugh that was half bitter, half nostalgic. This ambitious young man had no idea how efficient adult life would be at turning dreams into responsibilities. But there was something about the letter that bothered him. It wasn't naive. It was hopeful, yes, but also practical. The young James had made realistic plans, given achievable deadlines. He wasn't a dreamer out of touch with reality. He was someone who believed that security and adventure could coexist. That night, he did something unthinkable. He calculated how much money he had saved by being sensible over the past 10 years. The amount was substantial. He had enough resources to do almost everything young James had ever imagined. But somehow he had convinced himself that doing so would be irresponsible. When did being an adult become synonymous with giving up everything that doesn't generate income or status? When did he start treating his own dreams as unnecessary luxuries? The first step was almost accidental. James was having lunch alone in a restaurant when he overheard a conversation at the next table. An Italian tourist couple trying to communicate with the waitress. Without thinking much, he offered to help. For 20 minutes, he translated orders, recommended dishes, explained ingredients. It was a simple moment, but James felt something he hadn't felt in years, genuine usefulness. Not the corporate usefulness of solving problems that other people had created, but the human satisfaction of connecting people, of being useful without expecting anything in return. When the tourists left, they left a card with an address in Florence and an invitation. "If you come to Italy, our house is your home." He put the card in his pocket and seriously considered using it. The next day, he did something even more surprising. Instead of eating lunch at his usual table, he sat at the counter of a small cafe. He struck up a conversation with the owner, a gentleman who had started the business after retiring from engineering. "Working with coffee is totally different from working with machines," he said, "but I've never felt so alive. Every customer is a different story." James ordered a second coffee just to keep talking. There was something comforting about hearing about someone who had changed direction and had no regrets. The transformation wasn't an explosion, but an avalanche that started with small steps. James began breaking his own rules. He took a different route to work, tried restaurants he hadn't been to, accepted invitations he would normally have declined. He bought a plane ticket to Florence, not for his next vacation, but for the following month. When his boss asked about his unplanned vacation, James simply said, "I need some time to think." The reactions of his colleagues were telling. Some expressed covert envy, others genuine concern. "Are you going through a crisis?" asked Sandra from accounting. James smiled. "Maybe. Or maybe you're just coming out of one." He realized that for many people, any deviation from their established routine was interpreted as a problem. When did being fine start to mean not changing anything? At home, the dusty guitar got new strings. James didn't know if he would ever play the way he dreamed. But cleaning the instrument and trying out basic chords brought unexpected satisfaction. It wasn't about being good, it was about trying. About allowing himself to be a beginner at something. About rediscovering that competence was not a prerequisite for joy. As the fingers stumbled as they were on the ropes, he smiled genuinely. James was at the airport, backpack on, when he realized that the feeling of fear had transformed into something different, anticipation. He didn't know exactly what he would find in Florence, but it didn't bother him. Uncertainty had stopped being an enemy and became a traveling companion. He called Emma before boarding. "I think I found that boy who was digging in the backyard," he said. He was just buried under a pile of paid bills. The flight took off at sunset. James looked out the window and saw the city transform into a set of twinkling lights, then a distant constellation. He thought of all the people down below, trapped in their safe routines, and felt a mixture of compassion and gratitude. Compassion for having been one of them for so long, gratitude for having had the courage to leave. Life really did require more than paid bills. It asked for courage to be surprised, to be curious, to be imperfect, and yet tentative. When the city lights disappeared completely, James closed his eyes and smiled. He didn't know what story he would write in the coming months, but he had finally remembered that in it, he was both the author and the main character. Did you like this story? Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And tell me, what is that one thing you've always wanted to do, but keep putting it off because it seems useless?